Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Should we obey our government even when it has restrictive or immoral, illegal laws? Well, we're going to discuss this very question today as we dig into the famous passage in Daniel chapter 6, known as Daniel in the Lion's Den. I'm Russ Brewer, and you are listening to our daily study in the key chapters of God's Word, and today we're turning to Daniel chapter 6. Now, as we work through the book of Daniel and turn to chapter 6, we quickly find out that God's prophecies of Nebuchadnezzar are beginning to be fulfilled. After Nebuchadnezzar died, another ruler came on the scene named Belshazzar. He rose on up. He had a relatively short reign, and he dies at the end of chapter 5. And chapter 6 opens with a new ruler and a new empire. And now we're reading about Darius of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, at the time, the Medo-Persian Empire was the mightiest kingdom, the mightiest empire in the world. And in this might and in this power, verse 1 tells us that Darius began something of a reorganization project, and he appointed 120 officials called satraps over various districts in his empire. And here's what's amazing. In chapter 5, Belshazzar, remember the emperor who only lived for a little while and had a very uneventful reign? Belshazzar barely knew anything about Daniel. But here in chapter 6, Darius has such a high esteem for Daniel that he appoints Daniel to be one of the 3 governors of the empire. Now, it seemed that Darius had heard about Daniel's wisdom and how he had served Nebuchadnezzar, or maybe how he'd even prophesied of Belshazzar's death in chapter 6. And in all of this, and perhaps for other reasons as well, Darius decides to appoint Daniel as one of the top 3 rulers in the land. And so in verse 20, it says that these satraps, these 120 satraps, were accountable to Daniel and these other governors. Well, the other leaders were jealous of Daniel's success, and they began to look for ways to bring him down. First, they looked for any kind of corruption in his life that they could pin on Daniel. But verse 4 says they couldn't find anything where he had crossed any lines. He was totally faithful. This is a dude who was squeaky clean. And so they realized in verse 5 that the only way they're going to bring down Daniel was by concocting some scheme where Daniel's obedience to the laws of God would bring about disobedience to the laws of the land. And so Daniel's integrity was so solid, they could count on him being righteous, and then they would just use his righteousness as a way to ensnare him. And so these conniving leaders go to King Darius, and they tell him that they all want to create a law. This is the law where for the next 30 days, I'm just an arbitrary number. Hey, the next 30 days, no one can pray to any other god or any other man except for you, Darius. Now, all this was a lie because they say all of the governors were in agreement with this law. Obviously, Daniel wasn't, and he wouldn't be. And so this is just intended to trap Daniel. Now, Darius doesn't recognize the unintended consequences of this law. No doubt his ego is probably blinded by the possibility that everyone just be praying to him or seeking him. No other God in the land be sought but him. And that's just, depending on what you value in life, that might be pretty cool. And so he agrees to pass this law. And so these wicked schemers are just, again, they're so confident that Daniel is going to break this command because they knew there was no way that one of God's people could go 30 days without praying to him. And so this law just comes on out from Darius, and Daniel is faced with the question, what does he do? Now, many people might be tempted just to give in. After all, it's only for 30 days. Not only that, how many people pray in public anyway? Maybe you could still pray, but just do it in private, don't make a big show of it. Well, that's not how Daniel responds to this law. You see, to obey this law would be sin, obviously that, but it would also be sin for one of God's people to seem like they are obeying this unrighteous law. God's people are to stand and show what God's kingdom laws are like. And so in verse 10, Daniel is very deliberate in how he responds. He's now one of the governors of this land, and yet he's also a follower of the Lord, and he is called by God to show the world how kingdom people live. And so in verse 10, once Daniel knows that the decree has been signed, and just to make sure that his actions are clear to everyone around him, he goes into his place where he lives, and he goes to the windows that were open towards Jerusalem, and he continues his discipline of praying to the Lord 3 times a day. Now, again, this is not new. Verse 11 tells us that this is what Daniel just did. He did it previously. Just how he lived his life is how he walked with the Lord. And so it's no surprise that Daniel is breaking the law. And in verse 11, these malcontents, they see Daniel praying, and they there he is. They catch him breaking the law of the empire. And so they go back to Darius in verse 12, and they say, you have this law, and Daniel broke it, so send him to the lion's den. And then in verse 14, it says, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. You see, Darius is like, oh, I don't want to kill Daniel. And he's just looking for what loophole can I find, but he can't find any. Because as much as he's trying to change this situation, all of these other guys are like, dude, the law is the law. You got to obey it or face the penalty. And so finally, the king gives the orders for Daniel to be pretty much executed by lion. And as Daniel is being thrown into the lion's den, Darius says to him, your God, whom you currently serve, he himself will deliver you. It's always nice when you receive a little theological pep talk from the very person who's completely disobeying God in that moment. Now, no response is recorded by Daniel, but in verse 17, the lion's den is closed up and even sealed by the king. Now, on the one hand, this seems kind of heartless. He seems like he's kind of a friend of Daniel, and he's just kind of sealing his fate. On the other hand, this is also a way just to confirm the true miracle about what's going to happen. Now, just to pause for a moment, in my office at church here, if you've ever seen my office, I have a picture on my wall that was painted in 1872. I mean, it's just a print, but it was painted in 1872 by an artist named Britton Revere called Daniel's Answer to the King. It's a really cool painting. If you want to even just pause the podcast, in fact, I encourage you to pause the podcast and just Google Britton Revere's painting, Daniel's Answer to the King. It's a great painting. And I love this painting because it shows Daniel's courage. Daniel's basically in this darkened dungeon. He is surrounded by prowling lions. And just by the pose of the lions as painted in this painting, you can practically hear them growling. And yet Daniel, he's got these lions all around him just kind of growling and looking at him, wary of this guy just standing there. And Daniel is calmly and serenely looking out the window. He's looking out to the Lord and he's trusting God's protection and provision. He's not going to be bothered or terrified by all these lurking lions. He will fix his eyes on God and he will stand in his trust in the Lord. It's just this great painting of this moment as Daniel is trusting God even in the midst of the lion's den. Well, going back to Daniel chapter 6, verse 18 tells us that King Darius has pretty much the opposite reaction. He's basically freaking out. He spends the night fasting. He can't sleep. He couldn't be entertained because he's so worried about Daniel. Now, this is heartwarming because it just demonstrates Darius's concern for Daniel. But it also just shows us that Darius doesn't really know if God's going to protect Daniel. He doesn't really know, and he also, his conscience isn't clear because he's not really sure he's even doing what's right. I mean, here you have an example of someone who is carrying out an unjust law, and even they themselves aren't sure if they should be doing this. Well, at verse 19, at daybreak the next morning, Darius rushes into the lion's den, and he cries out with this troubled voice that says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel's reply is pretty much, yep, I'm here. I was found innocent before him and also towards you, O king. I have committed no crime. Now Darius is thrilled and has Daniel taken out of the lion's den. And in verse 23, Daniel says is not injured at all because he has trusted in God. Then the chapter ends with Darius returning just that ancient form of justice upon Daniel's accusers. And Darius has all of them and their families thrown to the lion's den. And needless to say, those folks don't enjoy the same protections as Daniel. Well, so that's Daniel chapter 6. And although it makes for just a compelling story for Sunday school, there's a more important point here, and this is an increasingly important point for us to understand in our day. Daniel's example here is showing us how God's people live in a world that is not surrendered to him. You know, Daniel is no longer in Jerusalem. He can no longer appoint a Jewish king to a chapter and verse of the Bible and say, hey, this is what we got to do. He's now in Gentile territory. This is a land ruled by non-believers who are just establishing capricious laws just on the whims of popularity. And so how do we handle these situations? Well, for one thing, what we're seeing here is that we are citizens of a higher kingdom. We are the citizens of God's kingdom, and so we must obey God's laws at all times. The laws of man never give us freedom to violate the laws of God. But having said that, this doesn't give us the permission to violate any old law we disagree with. I'm sure Babylon was filled with all kinds of rules and regulations that are not recorded in scriptures that Daniel and his friends were willing to and had to comply with. The issue is not whether or not we like a law or agree with it. The issue is whether or not obeying man's laws would force us to break God's laws. If a government were to establish a law that violates the law of our true king and the laws of our true kingdom, then we have to obey God's laws rather than man's. This is what Peter and the apostles do in Acts chapter 5, verse 21, when the Jewish leadership told them not to preach about Jesus. They answered, we must obey God rather than men. And so in Daniel chapter 1, for instance, their example shows us we should be wise and reasonable and seek to work with those who are in authority. In Daniel chapter 3, with the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it shows us we cannot worship any other god beside the Lord. And then here in Daniel chapter 5, the example of Daniel shows us we cannot stop the worship of our Lord. Now, these are specific laws. And any laws that are similar to these kinds of laws here that would keep us from the right worship of our God, those laws would have to be disobeyed. Going back, if you look at verse 22 here, verse 22 contains a key phrase in this passage. Daniel declares that he was not killed by the lions because he was found innocent before God. God protected Daniel because he was innocent. In other words, Daniel did not sin by violating Darius's law that prohibited the right worship of the Lord. Now, this is not a blanket promise that every innocent person will be saved from every attempt at taking their life. But it is an acknowledgement that there may be times when it is more righteous to break a law than to keep it. And even when we do break some laws, we are still innocent before God. And so as Christians who are citizens of Christ's kingdom, we need to understand the principles and laws of Christ's kingdom so that we know what it means to obey him at all times. This just continues the principle that we learned about a couple days ago. While we live on earth, we have a dual citizenship. We are dual citizenship believers. Our true kingdom is in heaven, and that is where our true current code of law resides. And yet we also live as citizens of our nationality, the country we live in, and we need to, by and large, be abiding by the laws of our kingdom. Now in America, our founding fathers tried to create a constitution that would allow the citizens of God to operate by God's laws while also operating within the spheres of righteous laws made by men. Likewise, our Constitution gives us the ability to alter the laws of our society through things like elections and referendums. Now, the system is not perfect, but it has been working for a while, and yet even in our own day and age today, it seems like these safeguards are increasingly being eroded, and so God's people need to have eyes wide open and recognize that our government is supposed to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. And when it does not operate in that way, we need to be prepared to step up, speak up, and be a part of making changes. But then at the same time with that balance, we also must live by the truth of Hebrews 13:14, which says, "For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come." You see, this is not the lasting city. There is still a city which is to come, and that must be the focus of our ultimate attention. Well, going on with a couple more thoughts about what we're learning from Daniel's example here. His example shows us the principle that obeying the law of God does not give us permission to break another law of God. For instance, we are not to deceive people. We are not to misrepresent the situation. Obeying God's laws to pray does not give us permission to hide or deny what we've done. We have to uphold all of God's laws, not just the ones that fit our preferences. This passage also shows us what goes into civil obedience. You see, when an unrighteous law has been forced upon us and we have to obey God's laws rather than man's laws, if that's the case, we still must deal with the consequences. We in our day and age might be fined, we might be arrested, there might be a consequence for our obedience to God and our disobedience to the local authorities. We just have to recognize that that's what it means to be a faithful follower of the Lord in our day and age. And finally, this passage is just a great time for us to ask this question. It's a common question, it's not my own. But the question would be, if it's illegal to be a Christian, is there enough evidence in your life to convict you? And just think about it. All of our lives are more or less supposed to be like Daniel's. We're supposed to be living as Christians in the world around us. And if it was illegal for us to follow Christ, our lives should be so dedicated to the Lord that we could be easily convicted. Well, we can go on, but those are some basic principles from this passage. Daniel's example here shows us that there are times when we may have to break the laws of our government to keep the laws of God. And yet when we do this, we are ultimately innocent before God. And since our lives are accountable to Him, that is the declaration that truly matters. Well, again, so much more could be said. And that's just enough to get us thinking about these questions. A lot of profound thoughts here. Thanks so much for listening to this podcast. I hope you have a great rest of your day. God bless.